London, 1854. On Broad Street in Soho, people are dying by the dozens, day after day. Cholera has torn through the neighbourhood so violently that residents in nearby streets are stuffing cloth into their windows just to block the smell of the dead. A physician named John Snow starts going door to door, asking every surviving household the same question. What did you drink? The pattern that emerges doesn't fit any medical theory of the time. People who drank water from the local public pump were dying. People who drank beer from the pub down the street were overwhelmingly surviving. That wasn't luck, and it wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was the physical reality of urban life for most of recorded history. Rivers and wells in nearly every city were contaminated. Human waste, animal remains, whatever people happened to throw into them. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all of it spread through water. People who drank the water got sick and often died. People who drank beer generally didn't. The reason comes down to basic brewing chemistry. Making beer requires boiling water, which kills the pathogens living in it. Then fermentation adds alcohol, which finishes off whatever the boiling didn't. None of the people relying on this for thousands of years understood the microbiology behind it. They didn't need to. They just knew, empirically, generation after generation, that beer kept people alive, and water sometimes didn't. Which is why, for most of human history, beer wasn't really a beverage at all in the modern sense. It was medicine. Medieval physicians prescribed it to newborns, to pregnant women, to the sick and the dying. Monasteries handed it to exhausted, dehydrated pilgrims as a first-line remedy. English sailors received a full gallon of beer per day as an official part of their naval rations, not for morale, but because water stored in barrels for weeks at sea became a breeding ground for disease, while beer held up. John Snow, standing on Broad Street, wasn't thinking about 5,000 years of brewing history. He was just trying to solve a public health mystery in front of him. But the answer he arrived at, that beer was safer than water, was something ordinary people had known through hard experience since Sumer. Snow didn't discover the pattern. He was simply the first to explain, scientifically, why it had always been true. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't new. Beer had been keeping people alive for 5,000 years before John Snow ever stood on Broad Street. Go back to Sumer, in what's now southern Iraq, around 3000 BC. If you had to guess what the very first written recipe in human history was for, you'd probably guess bread. Maybe a medicine, or a religious offering. You'd be wrong on all three counts. The oldest known recipe that survives from human civilization, the hymn to Ninkasi, inscribed on a clay tablet around 1800 BC, is a recipe for beer. And it wasn't a luxury, it was currency. Workers were paid in it, ration by ration, logged in state records right alongside grain and land. Egypt took it further still. The labourers who built the pyramids at Giza received roughly 4 litres of beer a day as part of their official wages. Not a reward. Fuel. And for almost the entire stretch of this story, the people brewing it weren't kings or priests or governments. They were women, brewing at home the same way they baked bread, passing the recipe from mother to daughter for thousands of years. In medieval Europe, they were known as alewives. And it was a respected trade, one of the only ones that gave a woman real economic independence. Which makes what happened to them next one of the strangest and darkest turns in this entire story. Medieval Europe inherited homebrewing directly from this ancient tradition, but the greatest centres of brewing in that period weren't private homes at all. They were monasteries. And here's a detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. The earliest monastic breweries were run by nuns. Nuns brewed for pilgrims, for patients in monastery hospitals, and for themselves during religious fasting periods when solid food was prohibited, but liquids weren't. The medieval church classified beer as a drink rather than a food, meaning it didn't break a fast. During the 40 days of Lent, monks and nuns were permitted to drink up to 5 litres of beer daily, their primary source of calories for the entire fasting period. They had a name for it, liquid bread. It was inside these monastery walls that brewing stopped being a household chore and became something closer to a science. Monks and nuns methodically tested recipes, recorded outcomes, and studied which herbs produced the best flavor and the longest shelf life. Sometime around the 9th century, monastic brewers began systematically using hops, a major shift from the older method of flavoring beer with brewed, a mix of herbs that typically included bog myrtle and yarrow. Hops turned out to be superior in nearly every practical way: better flavor, better preservation, dramatically longer shelf life. The transition from brewed to hops took centuries to fully spread, and it happened largely because of exactly this kind of patient, documented monastic experimentation. Monastery beer became, by reputation, the finest in Europe, good enough that pilgrims sometimes traveled hundreds of kilometers specifically to visit monasteries known for their brewing, not just their relics. German monks working in deep stone cellars developed cold fermentation techniques that would eventually become the technical foundation of lager, a style that today accounts for roughly 90% of the entire global beer market. Some of these monastic breweries are still operating exactly as they were centuries ago. Belgium's Trappist abbeys continue brewing according to traditions more than 700 years old. West Vleteren 12, brewed at the Abbey of St. Sixtus, regularly ranks among the best beers on earth, and the only way to legally buy a bottle is to physically travel to the monastery, call ahead on a dedicated reservation line, and receive permission to purchase it. To this day, the monks brew only enough to sustain the monastery itself, not a drop more, regardless of demand. But outside those walls, something considerably darker was already building. By the 13th and 14th centuries, beer in northern European cities had evolved from a household product into serious commercial business. Cities were growing, populations were expanding, demand climbed right along with them, and wherever real money starts moving through an industry, people inevitably show up wanting to control it. City authorities began requiring formal brewing licenses. Brewers' guilds formed, with membership requirements attached. The equipment needed to brew at commercial scale, large copper kettles, dedicated storage buildings, transport, got significantly more expensive, which meant brewing at that scale required real capital. And women in medieval European society had extremely limited access to capital, to credit, or to formal guild membership, not because they'd lost the skill, they'd been brewing for millennia, but because the entire emerging commercial system was structured in a way that shut them out of participating in it as equals. That alone would have been enough to push women out of an industry they'd built. But something considerably darker got layered on top of it. During the 15th and 16th centuries, the European witch hunt swept across the continent. And here's a connection that historians have only started drawing out relatively recently. The stock imagery used to describe a witch in period texts lines up, detail for detail, with the everyday visual reality of a working alewife. The tall, pointed hat that beer-selling women wore in the marketplace, specifically so customers could spot them from a distance. The household cat, kept in nearly every home that stored grain, to control mice. The broom used to sweep the brewing floor. The large, dark kettle used to brew the beer itself. Every one of these became a stock element of the witch stereotype, and every single one of them came directly from the Ordina, wry working life of a female brewer. No serious historian claims this was a simple, direct cause-and-effect relationship, but the visual overlap is too specific and too consistent to wave off as coincidence. A woman standing over a large kettle surrounded by herbs with a cat nearby and a broom in hand became a figure of suspicion during an era of escalating religious panic, and witchcraft accusations landed disproportionately on women working in exactly these traditional female trades: brewing, folk medicine, midwifery. By the 17th century, brewing in most European cities had become, functionally, a male profession. There was no single decree that banned women from it. They were pushed out gradually through a combination of economic exclusion, licensing restriction, and social fear, and the knowledge that had passed from mother to daughter for thousands of years shifted over the span of a few generations into the hands of male guilds, monasteries, and increasingly commercial breweries. It's against that backdrop, an industry newly consolidated under male capital-holding control, that one of the most famous laws in brewing history gets written. Before we get to that law, it's worth pausing on something the popular version of beer history tends to leave out entirely: Fermented grain beverages weren't a uniquely Mesopotamian or European invention. They emerged independently, in parallel, in societies that had no contact with each other whatsoever, which tells you something important about how basic and how universal this discovery really was. In ancient China, archaeological residue found in pottery from sites dating back roughly 9,000 years shows evidence of fermented beverages made from rice, honey, and fruit, arguably older than anything coming out of Sumer, though built on a different base entirely. Millet-based beers continued to be brewed across Chinese history for millennia, existing alongside rice wine as parallel traditions, before China's beverage culture eventually became dominated by tea and grain spirits, and beer as a category receded to the margins for centuries, right up until the 20th century, when Western-style lager was reintroduced and, as we heard in the opening of this video, the country quietly became the largest beer-consuming nation on Earth by volume. Across the Atlantic, entirely unconnected to any of this, Andean and Mesoamerican societies developed their own fermented corn beverage, generally known today as chicha, brewed for thousands of years before European contact, used in religious ceremony, in diplomacy, and in ordinary daily life, in ways that echo almost exactly how beer functioned in Sumer and Egypt, as currency, as ritual, and as a basic form of nutrition. None of these traditions borrowed from each other. They couldn't have, separated by oceans and millennia. And yet human societies on multiple continents, independently, arrived at roughly the same solution. Take a starchy plant, add water, let thyme and wild yeast do the rest, and you get a beverage that's safer to drink than the water around it, and calorie-dense enough to help sustain a civilization. That's not a coincidence of culture. That's basic chemistry meeting basic human need, discovered over and over, everywhere people settled long enough to farm. The year is 1516. Duke Wilhelm IV of Bavaria issues a decree that history remembers as the Reinheitsgebot, the German beer purity law. Its text is short. Beer brewed in Bavaria may legally contain exactly 3 ingredients: water, barley, and hops. Everything else is forbidden. On its face, this reads like a straightforward quality regulation. In practice, it was political and economic engineering dressed up as a quality standard. Banning wheat from beer reserved that grain for bread production, a real matter of state stability during years of recurring famine. Barley, meanwhile, happened to be grown heavily on land controlled by the Duke's political allies, so the law effectively protected their income. And banning the wider range of ingredients used elsewhere placed brewers from neighboring regions, many of whom relied on cheaper alternative ingredients, at a real competitive disadvantage. It was, in other words, a protectionist trade policy wearing the language of purity. But it produced a genuinely unexpected long-term effect. Bavarian beer, brewed under this rigid standard, actually did turn out to be more consistent than beer coming out of many other regions, and its reputation grew accordingly. When Germany unified in the 19th century, Bavaria made extending the Reinheitsgebot nationwide a condition of joining the Union. The law, in one form or another, stayed in force until 1987, when the European Court of Justice ruled it violated the principle of free trade within the EU. German brewers today are legally free to add nearly anything they want to their beer. Most traditional breweries choose not to. Not because the law still requires it, but because 500 years of that reputation have become part of their cultural identity. What began as protectionism has quietly become a marketing asset. While Germany was busy codifying purity, 18th century Britain ran into a completely different kind of problem. How do you get beer to India? British soldiers and colonial officials stationed there faced the exact same danger that had shaped brewing history for thousands of years: local water that could genuinely kill them. Beer wasn't optional. It was a necessity. But the voyage from Britain to India, around the Cape of Good Hope and through weeks of tropical heat, took months, and ordinary beer simply didn't survive the trip. A London brewer named George Hodgson worked out a solution grounded in the same basic chemistry that had made beer safe in the first place. Hops and alcohol are natural preservatives, so a beer brewed with far more of both should be able to survive the journey. In the 1790s, Hodgson began brewing exactly that kind of beer. After months rolling around in a ship's hold, it arrived in India not just intact, but noticeably improved. The constant motion and shifting temperatures of the voyage had transformed it into something richer and more layered than fresh beer typically was. British troops loved it. India Pale Ale became one of the most popular styles across the entire British Empire. Once 19th century shipping routes made the months-long voyage unnecessary, brewers figured out how to recreate that same distinctive character through other methods. Today, IPA is one of the most popular styles in craft beer worldwide, and American brewers have pushed the concept further still, producing double and triple IPAs bitter enough that a first sip can taste closer to medicine than refreshment. What started as a logistics fix for a colonial army became, 2 centuries later, a flavor profile enjoyed by millions of people who've never set foot on a ship bound for India. The 19th century did to beer roughly what the Industrial Revolution did to almost every other traditional craft. It converted something local and variable into something global and standardized. 2 specific breakthroughs made that possible. The first came from Louis Pasteur. In 1876, he published groundbreaking research explaining the role of yeast in fermentation and demonstrating for the first time how the brewing process could be scientifically controlled to produce a consistent, predictable result, batch after batch. Before Pasteur, brewing was fundamentally a gamble. One batch might turn out excellent, and the next might spoil for reasons nobody could explain. After Pasteur, brewers finally had real control over outcomes they'd previously left to chance. The second breakthrough was mechanical refrigeration. Before it existed, pale lager could only be brewed in winter and stored in cold underground cellars, because lager yeast needs consistently low temperatures to ferment correctly. Once mechanical refrigeration arrived in the 1870s and 1880s, lager could be brewed year-round in virtually any climate, opening the door to a scale of industrial production that had simply never been physically possible before. American brewers, many of them German immigrants, moved fast on both innovations. Companies like Anheuser-Busch and Pabst began producing light, pale lager at industrial scale and shipping it by rail across thousands of miles. By the close of the 19th century, a small handful of large breweries controlled a market that had previously been divided among thousands of small local producers. Centuries of regional brewing diversity started quietly disappearing. Beer, increasingly, tasted the same everywhere. This consolidation happened faster and more completely than almost anyone brewing beer in 1870 would have predicted. Local styles that had developed distinct identities over centuries, shaped by regional grain, local water chemistry, and techniques passed down within a single town or valley, got squeezed out not because they tasted worse, but because they simply couldn't compete on price or shelf life against beer brewed at industrial scale and shipped by rail. A style of beer that had once meant something specific to a particular city or region increasingly just meant beer, full stop, regardless of where you happened to be drinking it. And then a movement arrived that wanted to erase what remained of it entirely. The 18th Amendment took effect in January 1920. Producing, transporting, and selling alcohol became federally illegal across the United States. The temperance movement, which had spent decades campaigning for exactly this outcome, genuinely believed that within a few years, drunkenness in America would become a distant memory. Breweries shut down, bars closed. Newspapers confidently predicted that coffin makers and prison operators would soon see business decline, since crime and alcohol-related deaths were expected to plunge. What actually happened was closer to the opposite. Illegal breweries appeared across the country almost overnight. Underground bars, speakeasies, operated openly in every major city, frequently with the quiet cooperation of local police who'd simply been paid to look elsewhere. Organized crime seized control of production and distribution, transforming from scattered street gangs into billion-dollar criminal enterprises. Al Capone in Chicago, Lucky Luciano in New York. Prohibition didn't eliminate demand, it just handed the supply chain to people willing to break the law for profit. But there was a quieter development happening at the same time, one with far longer consequences. With commercial breweries silenced, ordinary Americans started brewing their own beer at home. Technically illegal, but in practice largely tolerated. Across those 13 dry years, millions of Americans taught themselves to brew, swapped techniques, refined recipes, and passed the knowledge along to friends and neighbors. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the United States quietly had a home brewing culture that hadn't really existed at that scale before the ban ever started. That culture would stay dormant for decades, and then, half a century later, it would ignite the movement that reshaped the entire global beer industry. By the 1970s, the American beer market had consolidated almost entirely into a handful of giant corporations, all producing a nearly identical pale, light lager from coast to coast. It was safe, it was consistent, and it was almost completely stripped of character. An entire generation of Americans grew up genuinely believing that pale, light, and flavorless was simply what beer was. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed a law legalizing homebrewing at the federal level. At the time, it barely registered as news, a minor bureaucratic correction, nothing more. Its long-term impact turned out to be genuinely revolutionary. Thousands of Americans who'd already been quietly brewing at home as a hobby could now do it openly, share recipes freely, and organize without fear of breaking federal law. Home brewing clubs sprang up nationwide. People rediscovered British ales, German wheat beers, Belgian Trappist styles, the entire spectrum of flavor that industrial consolidation had spent a century erasing. Some of these hobbyists eventually opened small commercial breweries of their own. The first wave of craft breweries appeared in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, brewing beer with real character, bitter, dark, aromatic, complicated, the same fundamental style of beer that monks and alewives had been making for 1,000 years before industrialization flattened it into pale uniformity. Major beer corporations largely dismissed the whole movement. Industry analysts predicted it would fail. The market disagreed. Today, the United States has more than 9,000 craft breweries in operation, more than at any other point in the country's history, Prohibition era included. And craft beer accounts for roughly a quarter of the American beer market by value. That revival spread well beyond American borders, reaching Europe, Australia, Japan, and Latin America, proving that a beer culture many assumed was permanently headed toward total uniformity was still fully capable of an extraordinary comeback. None of the people at the center of this story had any idea they were building something that would still matter thousands of years later. The Sumerian scribe carving the hymn to Ninkasi into wet clay had no way of knowing he was creating the oldest surviving written recipe in human history. The Egyptian official recording pyramid workers' daily beer rations never imagined his bureaucratic paperwork would outlive the pharaohs he served. The medieval nun who started adding hops to her brewing kettle had no idea she was reshaping the flavor of beer for the next 1,000 years. The alewife who lost her trade in the 15th century couldn't have known that 6 centuries later, the craft beer movement would, in its own way, hand brewing back to individuals working with their own hands and their own recipes, almost exactly where the story started. George Hodgson, solving a shipping problem for a colonial army, had no idea he was inventing a style that would define an entire corner of 21st century craft brewing. And Jimmy Carter, signing what looked like a forgettable regulatory fix in 1978, had no idea he was setting off a revolution. Beer survived witch hunts. It survived guild consolidation, industrial standardization, and a constitutional amendment written specifically to erase it. It outlasted every single force that tried to ban it, control it, or flatten it into sameness. Which brings us back to where we started. A Trappist monk in a Belgian abbey and a home brewer in a garage on the other side of the world are, in the most literal sense, doing exactly what a medieval alewife did in her kitchen and what a nun did in a monastery cellar centuries before that. Water, grain, hops, time. And at the end of it, the one drink that, for most of human history, was safer than water itself. The same drink that helped keep the survivors of Broad Street alive while our neighbors were dying just down the road. The same drink that began as a wage and somehow, 5,000 years later, became a global culture nobody has ever managed to ban, standardize, or stop for good.